Okay, guys, so again, before you come back to this video, I want you to take a look at the link that I posted for you on this slide, slide number 8, and take a look at it because I want you to have in your head the concept of a first-person account of what has become known as Anorexia Athletica. Anorexia Athletica. So please be sure you've watched the video segment before you come back and join me here on this video clip, okay? So once you've done that, I want you to join me back here and let's talk about what Anorexia Athletica is. This is a sport-induced subclinical eating disorder. So I've mentioned the term subclinical before in this class, not only in recent lectures, but in the past. Remember what subclinical means. It means a person has some of the characteristics of a diagnosable eating disorder, but not all of them enough to rise to the level of that specific diagnosis. Nonetheless, the characteristics that they do have of an eating disorder are nonetheless possibly creating physical, psychological, social, and emotional damage in their lives. So I want to talk a lot about this. Historically, one of the reasons that anorexia athletica has become something that clinicians attend to in treatment, even though it's not technically a diagnosable disorder in the DSM, is that they were noticing in their practices a higher prevalence of eating disorders or eating disorder type pathology and symptomology in athletes, especially elite athletes who were performing at very high levels of competition compared to non-athletes. And they were also noticing that those who were primarily impacted by this so-called sport-induced subclinical form of eating disorder were female athletes involved in what we call aesthetic type sports. So aesthetic meaning sports where the way you look is important and as important as how well you perform. So for example, gymnastics, dance, things of that nature, ice skating, okay, where weight is critical for high levels of performance, but it's also considered an aesthetically pleasing, beautiful sport where the presentation and how you look when you're doing it is also critical. Achieving very low body weight is also unfortunately, recent trend in several sports. Now, there is a reason for that in terms of performance. So ski jumping, if you've ever watched people do ski jumps and all those twists and turns and then somehow land, I actually saw it up close in training for the Olympic trials a number of years ago in Park City, Utah, and I watched up close people doing the ski jump. I was just fascinated by what they could do. Road cycling, climbing, rock climbing, as I mentioned, women's acrobatic gymnastics, rhythmic gymnastics, long distance running. This is just a handful, but these are all sports where lower body weight definitely does improve performance. You think about ski jumping where people have to twist and turn in the air. The lighter your body, the more easily someone can do something like that. Same with spinning. As an ice skater, gymnastic, tumbling, all of that stuff. Physical performance in the types of sports that I mentioned is determined not only by the individual athlete's motoric abilities, but also to a large extent by maintaining a low body weight. And this is just physics, right? If you're a physics person, you know that weight would play a role as well as motoric skill. Extremely low body weight then has been a trend in athletes in these sports that is deliberately pursued. To the point, though, of having a BMI, a body mass index, that is incredibly low, below 17, like in ski jumping. And that leads to some significant health risks that, as you know from my lecture on the physiological consequences of eating disorders, extremely low body weight, as you recall, has impact on electrolytes that can impact your heart. It impacts your bones. Everything I said in that lecture would apply here. The concept of anorexia athletica was introduced in the 1990s. Athletes, especially elite athletes, constitute a very unique, specific population. And there are many factors unique to their training, to their eating, to their psychological profile, and even to their symptomology as it relates to existing eating disorders. And so the idea is we need a category that is separate, this anorexia athletica, from ordinary eating disorders so that we can treat those unique factors that both trigger and sustain these characteristics of eating disorder problems for that particular group of individuals and not lump them in with all eating disorder folks. Anorexia athletica involves reduced energy intake. It involves reduced body mass despite very high physical performance engagement. In some ways, this does resemble anorexia because people with anorexia do kind of engage in nonstop physical activity as a means of warding off the fear of gaining weight that they have, very high levels of exercise. And so to that extent, it is similar to anorexia athletica. But anorexia athletica has some but not all eating disorder criteria. And so it is referred to as subclinical, as I said at the beginning of this video. Sometimes it does fall into that category I mentioned in a previous class of eating disorders not otherwise specified or other feeding behaviors. But again, it more closely resembles anorexia or bulimia than it does that otherwise specified category of eating or feeding behaviors. So really what researchers and clinicians are starting to do is view abnormal eating patterns and disorders not as an either or as categorical anorexia, bulimia, or otherwise specified, but rather as a continuum where we have people meeting the specific clinical criteria for anorexia, bulimia, and otherwise specified, people who are subclinical, and then people in these subclinical categories who are specific populations with unique characteristics like athletes. So the characteristics of anorexia athletica, again, because there are various categories of eating disorders, and they have their own diagnostic criteria, it's really important for clinicians to understand how anorexia athletica differs and how it's similar. So they can make a distinction between anorexia athletica and the other forms of eating disorders and treat it accordingly. The reduction in body mass and loss of body fat mass is really in anorexia athletica purely performance driven. It's not because the athlete is worried about how he or she looks. It's not an appearance issue. It's not excessive concern about body shape or gaining weight. It's excessive concern about performing less well. Having said that, some of the studies show that athletes who begin anorexia athletica as a result of performance-driven reasons do sometimes develop a form of body dysmorphia, where they become excessively concerned about their body shape and size. They start to feel that it's too large or misshapen for their needs. And then they'll sometimes compare their body shape and size or degree of fat with athletes they perceive to be more successful than them and start to feel like they need to look like that person to be at the same level of performance. That will often initiate disordered dieting and eating patterns, excessive over-exercising, and well beyond what even their coaches and trainers are prescribing for achieving high levels of performance. So it can morph into the excessive concerns about body shape and size that we see in the other eating disorders. Some athletes, however, will maintain a very low body mass year-round. And that too can increase the development, potentially, of an eating disorder like anorexia. Next, anorexia athletica should not be detectable after the cessation of an athlete's career. So if after that athlete is no longer competing, let's say in Olympics, in competitive gymnastics or ski jumps or whatever, and they're still engaging in these disordered patterns, then that might indicate the individual should be screened for one of the other more classic eating disorders. There are not that many tools that are available to screen specifically for sport-induced anorexia athletica, because so much of the eating disorder screening has focused on traditional non-sport driven forms of eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. Having said that, there is more attention to it now, and there is more of an understanding in the clinical system that athletes constitute a unique group of individuals with this particular form of disordered eating and exercise, excessive exercise patterns. There is a lot less known about anorexia athletica than we know about traditional eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia. And it's not clear, for example, whether the abnormal eating patterns and the excessive exercise is a consequence of an underlying traditional eating disorder like anorexia or bulimia, or if it's really the elite level athletic performance that drives the development of these disordered eating and exercise patterns. And this is where we get into also the idea of an addictive personality and obsessive personality type. Some argue individuals with particular obsessive personality types, addictive personality types are more likely, even in an athletic environment, to develop these disordered and excessive patterns of eating and exercise. Others argue it's not a personality type, it's the nature of the competition that will trigger these types of disordered patterns in the individual. It's also the case that many of these athletes, in addition to clinical eating disorders, will also suffer from atypical or subclinical eating disorders. So sometimes the line between something that's purely sport-driven eating disorder patterns and excessive exercise and something that is also part of a traditional eating disorder, sometimes that line is blurred in athletes. The incidence of at least one eating disorder related criterion was somewhere around 74% in research that looked at athletes in a variety of different sports. With regard to aesthetic sports in particular, the prevalence of eating disorders not otherwise specified was found to be about 12%. So again, as you can see, this is really best viewed as a continuum, because sometimes the line between the criteria for anorexia athletica and traditional eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia or eating disorder otherwise specified, it's not always clear what those differences are, although there are some. Having said that, researchers and clinicians still believe athletes should be treated as a unique population because their eating patterns, their activity levels, and even their personality traits are often different than non-athletes. As a group, they are more similar to one another, but as a group, they are different from non-athletes. And again, there are some patterns that athletes develop as a result of wanting to achieve high levels of success in their sport that do show similarities to traditional eating disorders, like traits, personality traits common to people with anorexia, perfectionism, for example, high levels of achievement orientation, food restriction patterns, binging and purging behaviors like we see in bulimia, hyperactivity, things of that nature, and as I said, perfectionism. A lot of this research has focused on female athletes in, as I said, aesthetic type sports, but there has been some research first reported in the 1980s, and there's been some since then, on a sort of simulated version, meaning very similar to, perhaps subclinical, of anorexia nervosa in male athletes. So there is some concern that the focus on females is really causing clinicians to miss these types of disordered eating patterns and exercise dependency in male athletes, and that anorexia athletica is not just unique to female athletes. Okay, that's a lot to take in. Kind of let that percolate in your brain. And then when you've done that, and this all makes sense to you, meet me on the next video.